You guys are at, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are super excited to have you here with us for today's virtual event. And before we hop into the discussion, I just want to take one quick minute to review the webinar meeting controls. So the Zoom webinar updates setup is it auto mutes everybody. So at any point in time, if you want to chime in verbally or vocally, there is a little raise hand or annotate gesture where you can raise your hand or drop a heart or whatever the little smiling faces are. So feel free to throw one of those up if one of you wants to ask a question out to the team together, because we're more than happy to accommodate that today and want your engagement and to chime in with your questions and thoughts. Or there are also chat features and Q&A functionality. So feel free to utilize that as well. I will be manning the chat while we have our experts here, who I will introduce in a moment, talking. And again, super, super happy to have your comments and questions, and we want to hear from you today and make it as interactive as possible. So don't worry about interrupting the flow or anything like that. Feel free to chime in when you have thoughts and questions. All right, so on to the good stuff. As you can see, I have two very important guests here today. Mr. Don Waldy, one of our expert sales leaders at vCom, who manages specifically network and cloud team. And we also have Chris Shankar, a senior member of Don's team, one of our technology solutions expert who also specializes in network and cloud and works with many of our customers today. So as you can probably tell from the title and from the expertise that we have on the call, we are going to be talking all things network and cloud, specifically focusing on cost-cutting strategies, and then diving into what innovation really looks like for these technologies in 2025 and beyond. Obviously, we work in a very fast-paced environment in the tech world, and things are constantly changing, and these are two experts from the vCom team who have their boots on the ground, who are constantly talking with customers and really supporting them and giving our customers the opportunity to utilize their expertise. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into today's discussion. Don, Mr. Waldy, as we know, there's always a lot of excitement and momentum at the top of a new year. We are rounding out Q1 right now. And that being said, from your perspective and what you're seeing so far, really what's top of mind for IT business leaders in 2025?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Thanks for everyone being here. So I'll kind of set the stage here. Without a doubt, Chris is the true expert here. I'm here to kind of talk about, the business setting, the business environment, what people are thinking about, and time again, these four things come up. I was in Seattle last week visiting customers, and every one of our visits, the customers are bringing up these topics because they're top of mind. And then also, hey, not only what they're thinking about, but what's the business outcomes they want to achieve. So Chris and I will try to talk about that. Chris has some excellent case studies about some business outcomes around this. But the four things that are just consistent across the board, I want to fuel innovation. And in order to do that, I don't have unlimited funds. I got to figure out how to have strategic savings. And I'm going to have a couple slides that go through that. Number two, AI as an innovation engine. I mean, the adoption of AI technology, I mean, we're all seeing it. We're using it. We're using it in our personal lives. We're using it in business. 92% of all businesses have said, hey, I'm going to boost my AI spending in going forward. So it is something that is top of mind, and what it does to help cost savings and help us move our organizations forward is phenomenal. Cybersecurity, cyber resiliency by design. Everything we are doing has to have the security around it because of all the attack spectrum that we are all getting hit on. So that is, again, coming at us nonstop. And then because of AI, this hyper personalized customer digital journeys from contact centers, or how you interact with apps, how you interact with a company, is just, again, hyper personalized. These four things are critical. The fuel innovation of strategic, for strategic savings. Let's talk about that for a moment. So to say, hey, my strategy is to move my organization forward, and I definitely need funds. I got to free up funds to do that. Well, the minute that strategy statement is stated, Then it drops to become very tactical. And I'm going to move this forward here. Second. Talk about, I think this is going to advance, Courtney.
Oh, is it working? There we go.
Okay. All right. So where are the savings coming from? And kind of going back to what people are saying and when we're visiting customers, they all have the same statement. How do I free up my best people and I can move them to the higher value uh, technology initiatives we need to accomplish? So certainly around cost savings, it becomes very tactical, as I mentioned. And you've got technology sprawl and redundant platforms. And then you've got utilization and optimization of current technology. And those kind of things, those two things, there's a lot of commonalities amongst these two. So as an example, vCom, we actually have a IT lifecycle management platform. It's a software that captures all this. So it's very easy for us to be able to go in and look at the costs and look at whether it's mobility costs, whether it's network costs, whether you have old POTS lines. Think of what's happening in your cloud spend. I mean, AWS and Azure bills, they just continue to climb month after month after month. So are those things being optimized? Are they being utilized? The biggest issue, the biggest challenge going back to what people are faced with, no one has the time to go really dig into this stuff. Everyone knows, yes, we've got to reduce spend. We've got to watch that spend so we can go create other higher value in our organizations. Well, again, you need good partners in order to accomplish it. There's too many things coming at IT and IT groups. They just cannot contend with it all. So you have to go work with your partners in order to accomplish again, the tactical part of the spend. Lower asset pricing, that's like, hey, how are you procuring this? How are you managing that? And I got a slide on that in just a moment here. And then what's the most crucial part of your cost? It's your people. You need to free up your people so they can, use their skills because they know your organization, they know what's the initiatives are, and them to deal with something that is a commodity or something of low value that you can utilize a partner to free up your best people so they can go work on that is super key. I have one example that I like to use. We have an account manager. He's phenomenal. His name's Aaron. He's phenomenal in front of customers. Now, we have automation tools for customers that we can give them pricing and we can help them with their network design. Well, there's still some manual processes around that. If they have a bunch of addresses, well, there's some manual parts of filling that out before we feed it into our machine for the automation. Well, so Aaron says, you know what? I'm going to ask AI to go out to the customer's website, get all those addresses, and put it in our Excel spreadsheet, which then populates and automatically uploads. So then he can get all the information and go talk to customers. And the most valuable asset or most valuable cost or time for for your people is human interaction. And so if we can free up Aaron because of AI and these other things, he can go talk to customers, which again advances our business and helps them advance their business.
Just quick chiming in, great question from the chat. And as Chris mentioned, we are going to get to that. So hang tight.
Again, we've seen things like this. The point of this is getting a design, getting sourcing it, procuring it, and then contracting is just one aspect of the cost. Maintaining that, the asset, service and support. Service and support, rule of thumb is 20% of additional cost per year is pretty standard. So, over 4 or 5 years, you're doubling the cost of whatever you procured. So all these other costs, and then likewise, uh, these are all real costs in your business. So if you can free up these resources are your people, so they don't have to do these things, and you can work with a managed services company, a great partner, uh, such as vCom and what we do. There's so all these costs then are savings that you get. So, uh, Chris, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. So much value in all of those pieces and different ways that we can help optimize environments and cut costs. And like we talked about with network and cloud specifically on the brain, Mr. Shankar here, how are you currently working with customers to experience those savings, but also exactly what was dropped in the chat, also to utilize the AI adoption and everything that is coming to market, and how's that working for businesses? What are some of those real world applications that you're seeing today?
Great. Thanks, Don and Courtney. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Oh, great. So I'll be addressing two aspects of this whole optimization and cost saving. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's network lifecycle management. Most people tend to treat network assets as a spot item. Unfortunately, a network asset has its own life cycle. It is born, it lives a life, and then it is replaced by something else. That's an important concept to remember as we move forward. So how do we optimize and save costs over there? There is one that I'll talk about first called network refresh, which is pretty straightforward. Enterprises have been doing that now for a few decades. There are more intensive areas like network re-architectures that can yield better savings. And finally, there is the aspect related to operations and finance offload, which applies both to the network side as well as more so in the cloud side. There was one question regarding FinOps, which will also be addressed as we move into the cloud side. So let me talk about the first one, network refresh. About the one thing that's almost certain, other than death and taxes and IT, is that you always get better technology at a lower price as you move forward. So I can guarantee you, you would have just signed a 1 or a 3 year contract, and I refresh your network 3 months from now, I can get a better price. That's just the reality of life. That being said, there's a methodical way to do this, and this is no different from any other problem. You've got a current network with technologies that may be a few years old. You've got issues with that. You've got a target vision of where you want to be. So essentially, what you need to do, you should be able to identify the new design requirements that you have, and then develop a benchmark of what's important to you and what's not. Identify providers, because we have seen in this case, the more the number of providers, the better your choices and lowers your cost. And then, whether through your procurement department or through any other process, you could launch an RFP. Finally, you analyze all these results, identify the finalists, and let's not forget, when you get into a contract, there are many aspects of a contract that can help you save a lot of money. For example, can you make the circuits co-terminus? That is, you don't restart a circuit again at a certain location just because you had to move addresses, because moves, adds, changes in a network are the reality of life. You always have enterprises that shut down locations, reopen new locations. You don't want to be on the hook for things like early termination fees and so on. So, how you deal on the contract side, all of this will play a very big role. So after you do a vendor comparison and based on your metrics, there's a finalist scorecard that you can develop and go out to a pricing and come back. This is where technologies will play a lot of difference. A few years back, most of the people were deploying MPLS, VPLS, point-to-points, wave circuits, and so on. Increasingly, as the workload is moving more and more to the cloud, there is a use of not just point to points to the data center, but maybe replacing some of the more expensive layer 2 circuits with some sort of fiber broadband or a DIA or even best effort cable if it's possible, overlaying multiple devices that you would have at, let's say, a branch office or a central office or a data center. No point in layering switches on top of routers, on top of load balancers, on top of firewalls. You could do all that today with just a single device, be it a software defined network, a SASE platform, or an SD-WAN platform. So you get savings not just in the physical cost of the network, but also in consolidating all this equipment into one piece. And by orchestrating this through a central orchestrator, your ops costs also go down. Believe me, provisioning a network in a remote has become so simple these days. You could ship this box, a SASE box or an SD-WAN box, to a remote site if a person knows how to plug it into the power socket and stick an Ethernet cable. This product will come alive. It'll go through the connection, go and search for its latest firmware software from the orchestrator, download itself, and put itself in service. And in 5 minutes, you're going to have blinking green lights. This is different from somebody hopping on a truck, going to a physical location, swapping out boxes. Okay. So that was an example of how you would do that every time you do a refresh. Going a little deeper over here, about 5 or 6 years back, as people started moving, and I'm sure at this point, everybody has some sort of a cloud strategy. There is something called a 7R approach to doing cloud transformation. If you have used somebody in the past, whether it's an IBM consulting or an Oracle consulting, you will know very well that as you move on-prem applications to the cloud, you've got to decide whether you want to retire a certain application, re-platform, rehost, redesign. There are 7 R's that you have to consider. But once you have done that, the early deployments on the cloud, most of the cloud providers, the CSPs, whether it's AWS, whether it's Azure or it's GCP, in order to assure five nines reliability, insist that you should have dual connections to their data centers. That made a lot of sense early on when you were only connected to one CSP. Before you know it, you are now adding a second and a third CSP. What would that cost you typically? If a single, let us say, 1 or 2 gigabit point to point was about $3,000. Now, when you've got redundancy to AWS, Azure, as well as GCP, all of a sudden now you're paying $18,000 a month. Instead, if you move forward now, you have solutions from many data center providers, like there's an Equinix Cross Connect, which is more like a cloud router. Or if you want to be agnostic to the data center, you've got players like Megaport or Alkira or Packet Fabric. All you would do is replace all those 6 point-to-points at $3,000 each by a single pair of redundant point-to-points that goes to the data center. And on the back end, you would have multiple VLANs going to each of these CSPs. And you can statistically distribute the usage as well as throughput to each of these CSPs in any manner that you want. So all of a sudden, you have replaced 6 P2Ps with just 2, and that is yielding you almost 67% in savings. So this is the kind of stuff, for example, Don was talking about. You want to use your really expensive CISO's department, whether it's somebody who's a CCNA or a CCIE, to be doing this kind of work and not chasing network outages and things like that at 3 a.m. in the morning. Okay. Now let's move on to the cloud because that is where most of the world is headed. What are the challenges we are facing in the cloud today? Number one, complex pricing models. If you look at AWS alone, there are 6 or 7 different pricing models. You've got the hyper connectivity and the hyper compute models. You've got the accelerated kind of models in order to do things like graphics processing. You've got pay as you go models. You've got spot instances. You've got reserved instances. And you take that terminology, now multiply that across 6 or 7 different cloud providers. All of a sudden, you've got so many 3-letter acronyms that you can't make sense of your invoice anymore. Okay. So the same problems that existed in the network have just compounded in the cloud now. This misallocation of resources. One big thing with the cloud, as we have all learned, is if you had on-prem compute infrastructure, that's like saying I have servers, I have desktops. If you left for the evening and you didn't turn it off, you were not paying any extra money because that is capex, that is sunk cost. Now we got to change our mindset and think in terms of a utility. If you are at home and you just use the faucet and the water, you finish using the faucet, you would turn it off. If you left a room, you would turn off the lights. If you forget to do that in the cloud, you're going to get a shocking bill at the end of the month. These are things you have to be cognizant of. These are all the hidden expenses, right? You've got orphaned resources. You might have overutilized or underutilized resources. These are all contributing to soaring cloud costs that you need to be monitoring on a daily basis. And that's the big difference with the network. In many cases, there are fixed price in the network for 3 years of the contract. That is not the case when you're scaling in the cloud. So let's talk about some ways in which you can optimize your resource management in the cloud. First thing to do is to find out and eliminate orphan resources. Many of the enterprises, they have found there is shadow IT. If somebody gets hold of a corporate credit card, spins up VMs, multiple cores, a lot of memory and a lot of storage, there is spot usage that is done. And before you know it, the work is done and they move on without turning it off. You will be surprised how many orphan resources are sucking up your bill. That is one thing to watch out for. The second thing is to optimize traffic flows. Latency is very important. We understand in real-time services as people are going and using more video conferencing and let us say even UCaaS or CCaaS, low latency seems to be the buzzword along with low jitter, let's say, or packet loss and things like that. But many times you would realize, or it would behoove you to know, that the shortest latency path may not be the most efficient because everybody is crowding the servers with the shortest latency. This server might be overused. And because of that, you might find if you went a couple of blocks down the road or a few hundreds of miles down to a different data center, the latency impact might just be a couple of more milliseconds, but the servers are much more available. So you got to introduce server availability when you optimize your traffic flows. Transit gateways, these are the hubs that connect your VPCs, the virtual private and public clouds. They tend to be the choke points. You got to make sure that they're properly load balanced. Otherwise, you're going to have excess utilization of one, not enough utilization in the other. You got to implement serverless computing. Unlike what the name says, serverless doesn't mean there are no servers. It simply means that you're not using your own, you're using scalable servers in the cloud. The fifth item here is containerization. This is very big with Docker and Kubernetes and so on. As people move their workloads from one cloud to another, it is very important that the software, the applications, the libraries, the tools, the APIs, everything that go with it reside in a self-contained unit. So you could move that across different clouds and not have to rewrite code. And that's very important. This is a big saving in terms of coding as well as OpEx. And finally, adopt a microservices architecture. Why is that important? You don't have to bog down a simple task that you need for your business with all the legacy baggage that comes with an older program. Try to implement smaller microservices that can be very rapidly deployed, they can be troubleshot very easily, and they can scale very easily. Okay. So how is AI and ML playing a big role in this? First of all, predictive right sizing. Most businesses fall into three categories. Either you're a secular business, you're a seasonal business, or you're a cyclical business. If you're a secular business, you might be a startup and your business is continuously growing. A scalable platform is great. If you're seasonal, imagine your H&R Block or Intuit TurboTax. You're going to need a lot of compute, memory, and storage between January 1st and April 15th. After that, you could pretty much slow down things. I see something in the chat. Okay.
That's just me reminding everybody.
All right. So, depending on whether you are seasonal, cyclical, or secular, you got to be able to use AI and have some degree of predictive analytics to know how to be ahead of the curve and make sure that your resources are properly sized in the cloud. The second thing in using AI and ML is anomaly detection. You got to make sure what patterns should look like. If you're an engineering heavy organization and you suddenly see a spike in usage from marketing, sales, and finance, that has to invoke your curiosity. Why is this happening? It's got to be my engineering team that is using most of my cloud resources. So that's an example of anomaly detection to find out where things are going wrong. Be very judicious in reserved and spot instances. As you know, if you're able to sign up for reserved instances, whether it's on a 1 or a 3-year term, you get big breaks. Spot instances are much more optionable. The danger with that is some of your workloads could come down if there's a higher priority interrupt that comes in. So these are all ways in which you can reduce the cost depending on the key here really is everyone is playing the game in a cloud in distributing the cost between fixed costs and variable cost. The more you can predict what your business is and move that bucket into the fixed cost, the better off you will be at the end of the year. But you got to do a good job of sizing that. Auto scaling or bursting in the cloud for excess capacity that you need is another way. And finally, storage optimization. I have seen so many customers go and always use express zone storage in AWS. This is like saying, I might need this data anytime, all the time, instantly, and it has to be synced across all the zones. Well, you're going to pay through your nose for it. Why don't you look back and say, you know what, if I can get Glacier storage on Amazon for 1,000th of a penny per gigabyte, why not do that? I don't need replication across zones. Maybe I use some of the less used data and move them into Glacier storage as opposed to Express Zone storage in AWS. By the way, I'm using a lot of AWS terminology here, but this applies equally to Azure, to GCP, the Oracle Cloud, Alibaba Cloud, IBM Cloud, you name it. Except you take all the jargon, multiply that by 10 if you want to add confusion. That's what it is. Okay. There's a delay in advancing.
We actually do have another question in the chat
Okay, what is
asking,
the question?
what are some of the means to realize cost savings in case of edge computing opportunities?
Um, First of all, your application should lead itself to using edge computing. And in general, that would be applications where there is the need for low latency. And this might be, for example, if you're a cellular operator and you want to make sure you're delivering services in a 5G network very close to the edge, then you want to make sure that your radio access network as well as your EPC are all stored close to the edge of the network. So you got to first make sure your application warrants use of edge computing, and whatever that you need to do for your particular vertical in terms of deciding whether you're better off with some hybrid of a centralized and an edge compute or staying exclusively the edge compute. And edge compute can mean different things. For example, when you look at Netflix is a classic example. How are we doing on time, Courtney?
We've got about 13 more minutes left.
Okay, good. I can give this example of Netflix. This is very good. So Netflix has a huge number of titles in its library, but they have to deliver this content to any sort of a device. It could be a very small smart screen here with a certain resolution. It could be an iPad. It could be a desktop. It could be a massive 85-inch screen, all with different resolutions. You can imagine now if they have to maintain every version of every title in each of these resolutions in order to transmit it, right? That is going to be a huge storage problem. Instead, what they would do is something called transcoding. Transcoding says that I've got a high density video codec on my right side, and I've got edge compute now at my cache servers, and I'm quickly going to look at what resolution is needed. If my screen is small, I'm quickly going to transcode from one type of video codec to another and transmit it. So now, instead of having thousands of versions of the same title, all they need to do is maintain one SD version and one HD version. That's all they need to do. Okay, that's one example. This is a great case study here for one of our customers. We found, and this is not a mistake that the customer did. Anytime somebody is embracing the cloud for the first time, you have no idea about how it will be utilized. You don't have data that has come back in terms of monitoring or utilization. So they ended up having a fairly oversized application gateway, which was actually a web access firewall, which they're oversized in terms of active connections that are coming up or persistent connections or the type of cryptography that is used for some of the encryption that goes back and forth. So we looked at that application gateway and we were able to save almost 80% by right sizing it, reducing the compute that was needed. We did the same thing also for the Azure SQL environment. That was also significantly oversized. We were able to see, and you can see that on the slide here, over a period of time, the costs came gradually down and so did the savings going up. And they are at a happy medium now where they're only bursting for any scalable need that they have. Okay. FinOps, this was a question that was raised by Vikram. FinOps is something that tightly couples the use of the cloud with the financial department. In the network world, the pricing used to be fairly static. Whereas in the cloud world, it turns out it is changing dynamically, not just on a daily basis, but an hourly or even by a second or a minute basis. What this means is that finance has to be tightly coupled with operations and use AI tools very effectively along with KPIs to make sure that they don't have a shock at the end of the month or the end of the quarter, which typically is when they would sit back and realize what are our expenses going to look like. And I'll address more of this as we go forward. So how would you do FinOps and in a governance and automation way? First, you have to set up budget alerts. Everybody has to work with budgets. No runaway budgets, no shadow IT. You got to have policy-based automation. I gave the example of the faucet and light turning off. If there are non-production resources outside working hours, set up a script to turn it off. And then if somebody needs it, they have to make an exception. Set up KPIs, cost per feature, cost per customer, cost per transaction. You can't treat everything the same or you'll have runaway costs. You have to do tagging and labeling so you can identify which project or team is busting their budgets. Do real-time monitoring, and I'll talk about a few tools right after this. And finally, allocate chargebacks. That's where the pain comes in. Unless each department that's using the cloud is paying for it, you're never going to see a change in behavior. That's why you need to do chargebacks and showbacks to show accountability. Okay, great. Tools for optimization, and this is by no means a complete list. You can take this and multiply by whatever number, 10, 50, if you want to see actual numbers there. There are cloud provider native tools. And of course, the leaders, AWS, Azure, GCP have their own tools. There are third-party FinOps tools. You can use Spot, which was acquired by NetApp and is now Cloud Checker, or you could use Cloud Health by VMware. And a lot of these are Aptio, Cloudability. And then there is the entire universe of enterprises who love open source automation and tools simply because the rate of innovation in that space is very high. Of course, you got to make sure that you have the proper maintenance and support to do some of the areas in open source. For example, Pulumi, Prometheus, Grafana, Terraform, depending on which one you want to use, these are all very popular tools that are used for automation as well as open source for optimization of the cloud usage. So again, like I said, this is only a very small sampling of the tools available. This list keeps growing. You just have to pick what is right for your own enterprise. Even under AWS Cost Explorer, you have many sub tools, almost 8 or 10 of them, depending on whether you just want to monitor, do you want to change the behavior, do you want to do scripting, all of these things. They're handled by the big players as well as the small players. I believe this was my last slide. So if there are more questions in chat, happy to take that.
Well, Chris, let me just kind of add to what Chris was just presenting because there's so much technology information here and really good stuff. I just listened to him, I was like, man, there's just so much to know. Going back to having discussions with our customers, that's the challenge. Like there's like so much, everything goes through IT to figure this stuff out. So you really need utilize and leverage your partners. We like to say that when vCom comes to the table, we add 200 people to their IT staff because again, it's what Chris and I have been talking about. The strategy is one part of it, but then getting to work, the tactical part's another big part of it. Like for example, we go do cost savings. Guess what? You gotta pull the invoices and you gotta analyze them and you gotta put some critical thinking about that. And it's like, okay, you gotta take what Chris has covered and re-architect stuff that makes business outcome sense and to save money and move your organization forward. That takes a lot of people working on your behalf to do that. So again, having great business partners and advisors is just critical, and certainly having people like Chris available to you is a big bonus.
Yeah, I have a question for you guys, for both you and Don and Chris. How do you get AI as a mindset in an organization? Obviously, there are so many new things coming at the market. I think AI is top of mind for everyone. It's marketed everywhere. That being said, I have heard feedback from customers in the past, like, oh, there's a little bit of hesitancy. I don't know what's right. I don't know which tools to adopt. How do you guys work through that with customers?
Changing the mindset, that's an interesting question. That is one reason why I love lazy people. They are the most inventive, right? Because if you didn't have lazy people, you would never have a washing machine or a dryer. And the same concept applies to AI. Today, almost any task that comes, the first thing is I try to see if I can use AI for it. It's only if I cannot use AI, and I have got the tabs on 6 different AI engines, you name it, right? Each one has its strengths and weaknesses. You go from top to down, you got Perplexity, you got Claude, you got Gemini, you've got Chat GPT, you name it, right? Anthropic. I go in sequence through each of the AI engines. I feed the answers from one AI into the other AI. And it finally perfects an answer that I want, all in a matter of 30 seconds to a minute, what would have taken me typically a few hours to do. So that's my shout out to lazy people to get an AI
I love it.
mindset.
Be lazy. What do you want to offload doing? AI can do it for you.
Right.
Oh, and we do have one last question here in the chat. On a lighter note, how can we leverage AI to clone Chris and Don? I mean, if only we could figure that out. We need like
I'm not
20.
even here.
That's a great question. When you figure it out, let me know. Aren't we like cloning sheep somewhere in the government,
No,
right?
believe
Isn't
me,
that a thing?
that day is coming. That day is coming.
Bicentennial Man is real life. One
Yes.
more thought I just had, since I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, but of course, everybody feel free to chime in. Chris, you had lightly touched on KPIs when it comes to managing your cloud. Anything you want to expand on that, or what are some important things to think about?
Yeah, the point I was trying to make that is the reality is most enterprises are going to have a mix of different types of customers. And the cost to deliver a service in your vertical to that customer is going to be different. You're not going to treat, let's say, how you have an SLA to your well-paying, let's say, healthcare or finance customers the same as you would do, let's say, to somebody who's not SLA sensitive. Be aware of those differences and come up with KPIs for it. So, for example, if you're using some of the pay-as-you-go expensive, scalable, on-demand resources for these top customers, you may want to start looking at, spot instances. I'll tell you a classic example. I was sitting next to a Canadian entrepreneur when I was flying once, and he was in a startup. He said, Chris, I have this problem which AWS solved brilliantly for me. And he said, I have 10 different programmers. They have written a great application on a web. But tomorrow, if 1,000 people hit my website, I don't know if it's going to crash. In the olden days, I had to go and create a server farm to go and hit this website. Now I just go on a spot instance and I can bid at an auction type of a value on some of these compute on AWS. And here I am chugging along at a thousandth of a penny for my compute. Tomorrow, a large pharmaceutical firm that is trying to get FDA approval might be willing to pay more money. They would come and start ramping up their VMs. If that happens, your VMs are going to start slowly shutting down, right? And so they get priority. But then you could say, fine, I'm a startup. You know what? If I get the results of my test tomorrow, that's fine. I'm not waiting for an FDA approval. So keep in mind the KPIs that you're using. That's very, very important. If you treat every customer, every instant the same, then you're going to pay the price for it. So be aware of what KPIs are important for each customer.
Love it. Keep in mind the specialization.
Yeah.
Well, we're about 2 minutes to time here. And as you can see on this screen, Chris and Don are available should you have any follow-up questions. These are their phone numbers and email addresses. And of course, if you're new to vCom and this is your first time really joining us on any of our webinar events, go ahead and check out our website, vCom Solutions, or you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And yeah, reach out anytime that you would like. And of course, if you're a customer on the call and want to expand this conversation further, go ahead and reach out to Don and Chris as well. We are here for you. And thank you all for your time and attention. Vikram, you are the all-star of this call with all of your wonderful questions. Thank you so much. And we appreciate everyone being on here today and hope that you can join us for another one of these workshops in the future.
Thank you, guys.